think my first introduction to psychedelics was through the party scene in London when I was in my early 20s. And I was fresh out of the army, which in Israel is kind of like a mandatory thing. So for 3.5 years, I was in an environment that was very oppressive and very disciplinarian. And well, I mean, that's a whole other story. After that, I moved with my friends to London, and very soon we discovered the underground squat rave scene. And that was the beginning of a honeymoon phase, mostly with MDMA, and then leading up to LSD and other psychedelics. Very soon afterwards, we made a trip to Amsterdam, and we tried mushrooms back in the day when you still find them in mushroom form legally in grow shops. And I think very quickly I realized that beyond the sheer fun and connectivity and social aspect and like kind of like radical joy aspect, all of those things, very quickly I realized that there were also the kind of like fundamentally profound processes within me that were being catalyzed by those experiences. An ability to assess life in a different way and respond differently to it, and maybe have like a wider set of responses to events that I had up until then. So very quickly I got interested not only in the party enhancing capacities of it, which are great and super important in my opinion. I'm always an advocate for recreative use. That's something that I always kind of try to bring forward, because nowadays I think there's an ongoing demonization, recreative use. Then obviously there was kind of an awareness of the potential that these substances have for catalyzing processes that were deeper than that. So yeah, I mean, I got really interested in it. After my first few experiences, I decided that I needed to go and study psychology, because I was in a moment in life after the army where I was figuring out what to do next with my life. I knew that I wanted to go to university, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And then there was one particular LSD journey in a festival in Barcelona where it became crystal clear to me that the thing that was most interesting for me was the human mind. And what better way, I thought, to study the human mind than to go to university. I did my bachelor's, kind of like a joint degree in psychology and cognitive science. And from there, I started working in a psychiatric hospital, which was kind of part of the program that I was in. At the beginning, I was volunteering in an inpatient ward, mostly working with people who were diagnosed with psychotic disorders. So very, very early on, I kind of came face on with people who were suffering deeply, diagnosed with schizophrenia mostly, both in acute states and chronic states of schizophrenia. I spent 3 years working in psychiatric hospitals and other psychiatric environments like midway homes and so on and so forth. And again, like pretty quickly, pretty early on, I realized that there was something fundamentally wrong with the way that we were addressing severe mental illness. And although I really enjoyed working with people, I really disliked working within the constraints of biological psychiatry and whatever that system had to offer to people who were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And then very soon I realized that I was mostly an agent of social control, distributing pills and making sure that people swallow their pills, but not really being given, offered, taught any other skills, tools, perspectives, anything other really than controlling how many pills people took every day. I mean, this is a great simplification, and this is not an anti-psychiatry diatribe. Obviously, this is like very nuanced and complex issues, but for me personally, that was an awakening. I was like, well, I mean, I do want to work with people who are suffering. I definitely want to know more about what schizophrenia is, what madness can be, how can we address that as a society in a way that makes more sense than what was back then on offer. I think things have changed a little bit now. This is maybe 15 years ago. Some places do offer a wider array of interventions. There's things like open dialogue that have become more popular and so on. But 15 years ago, at least in Israel, the options were very limited. So after a few years of doing that, I decided that I wanted to go out into the world and explore really the roots of what mental illness is and how those things might be addressed differently in different cultures. I mean, I did realize that what we call mental illness and madness in particular, beyond the diagnostic construct that we call schizophrenia or psychosis or bipolar disorder and so on, much of that is culturally defined, and much of that is a construct that psychiatry in the West has that peculiarity in that it differs from the other branches of medicine, right? In which diagnoses and diseases are always subjective. Like there aren't really biomarkers or biological ways of saying like this is an actual thing that exists in the world. Schizophrenia is a thing that we can observe under a microscope, but actually like really it's just like a subjective construct that is helpful to some extent. And I went to figure out what mental health and mental illness mean in other parts of the world that weren't attached to that particular model, you know, in kind of Western biological psychiatry or neo-Kraepelinian psychiatry. So I spent some time in India, I spent some time in Peru, I spent some time in Mexico, mostly with traditional communities, asking questions, exploring their lifestyle, and like really just seeing what kind of interventions they have, what kind of diagnoses they make, what is the perceived etiology of different disorders. Is depression and anxiety a thing that is experienced in the same way by different people? Is madness, definitions of madness similar? Hint they're not, right? This needs change radically. And yeah, I mean, after a few years of like traveling and observing and asking questions and experiencing other cultures and so on, I went back to school and I chose medical anthropology as kind of like my new framework. It made sense to me. Medical anthropology, cultural psychiatry, global health. And I went back to school. I wrote my master's thesis on non-pathologizing approaches to schizophrenia, mostly, or to psychosis, which is published. I can provide a link later for whoever is interested in it. And after that, I kind of like wanted to go back to, well, I mean, so my master's was pretty much kind of like a very intellectual, very analytic work of, for me, learning about everything that is wrong with the way that biological psychiatry works. Yeah, like that was kind of like my project, was to deconstruct and understand for myself why I had been so dissatisfied with the work that I had been doing. But then when I finished that, I realized that it wasn't enough to, for myself, it wasn't enough to deconstruct everything and diagnose why everything is fucked up, but rather, you know, I also wanted to explore what could be like different options that work better, what could be the resistance, what alternatives I could explore that actually address human suffering in a much deeper and much more humane way. And that, again, led me back to psychedelics. So I found work in an ayahuasca retreat center in the Peruvian Amazon. In the beginning, I was mostly helping with kind of like a sister organization that is a non-profit that addresses mostly environmental concerns and different struggles of traditional Amazonian people. And then as time progressed, I got more and more involved with the actual facilitation of the workshop. And I decided that I also wanted to use that opportunity to find a few research collaborations that I could participate in while I was there, because it was such a rich environment with so much, you know, so many people coming in back and forth, and you know, experiences of healing and encounters and disencounters. Like it was kind of like an ethnographer's dream. So I thought like, well, this is the perfect place to do some qualitative work, and also obviously gather data for my own PhD, which is the ongoing project that I have right now, just finishing writing my thesis, which is pretty much based on hundreds, well, not hundreds, but dozens, around 100 and so interviews that I gathered while I was working in the Amazonian rainforest. So interviews with people who went there for a workshop, many of them struggling with depression, anxiety, the different afflictions of civilization, and were seeking relief, healing, and growth through an ayahuasca retreat. So interviewing them, asking questions like, what is the thing that you felt was the most useful for you, so on and so forth. A few collaborations with kind of well-established research groups in the psychedelic scene, such as ICEERS, the Beckley Foundation, Imperial College. Most of my research is ongoing. I have all the interviews. Unfortunately, since COVID hit, I imagine, as for many other people, I had to radically rearrange my priorities because my life changed radically. I had to leave the jungle. I had to leave my work. I had to leave my research site in many ways. I had to figure out basic financial and logistic issues first. So, after a year and a half, 2 years, I'm now back on track. But definitely there has been a hiatus in processing all of that info. But yeah, so all the qualitative work through collaboration with institutions and basically like trying to figure out how can ayahuasca, or how is ayahuasca helpful or beneficial for people who want to address the deeper layers of their psychic or mental and emotional suffering. Yeah. So I think like the thing that immediately struck me when I was there after a while was how um, it's kind of like this process of medicalization and psychologization that plant medicines have gone through and are going through. That are very much kind of like married to many of the values and ideologies that underlie kind of Western neoliberal culture, right? Being present in the jungle, like, myself going through kind of this apprenticeship process through my Shipibo maestros, I also learned to work with ayahuasca and kind of get a deeper sense of the different plants that they use. But really, like what struck me most was really like the distance that exists between the way that traditional people address human suffering and address the plants that they treat this with. The whole construct, right, of like their medical system and the approach to human suffering and kind of just like human health, as opposed to kind of like the Western one, which we very easily translate there. So there has been kind of like this ongoing medicalization and psychologization of plant medicines, which basically means that the approach tends to be extremely psychoanalytic, for example, right? Like we kind of created this model of plant medicine work where we are like then kind of the mainstream narratives are like plant medicines are medicines, and they're medicines because they can help us heal kind of like the deeper traumas. They can help us uncover kind of like deep rooted kind of like hidden memories that we have not addressed. Psychoanalytic ideas. They're very psychological ideas that come from the Western psychological world of meaning, right? Whether to really understand the Amazonian worldview and how these plants are medicines for them in the original context, right? First, it's important to understand kind of like the local world in terms of what the ontology is like and what is the epistemology like, which basically means what is the world made of according to these people, and how do you acquire knowledge? How do you know what exists in the world? How do you make sense of information in that world? What kind of entities exist in that world? Like what kind of interactions exist between human people and the other entities that exist in that world? So the scope is much broader than just like a hyper individualistic, personalized psychological view, right? We have a way of working in the West with plant medicines, which is very, very, very tailored to suit the individual needs, right? Like, well, you have this medicine and that will help you as an individual figure shit out, right? So you can heal and you can grow and so on and so forth. Is a technology that pretty much serves to enhance or aggrandize or basically address kind of like the construct of the individual self, whether in the original context, when you actually start looking at the relationships that exist in the world and the way that the ontologies are constructed and the way that people extract information from the environment, ayahuasca and other similar technologies are not necessarily technologies of the individual or technologies itself, but they're in their essence relational technologies. Right? They're in their essence, in the most basic sense, their technologies' primary function is not introspection, is not individual healing, is not psychological whatever. It's the maintaining and the building and maintaining of harmonious and balanced relationships amongst people, but also amongst people and more than human people. Humans are spirits or have spirits, but also like non-human have spirits, like the plants and the birds and the trees and the weather patterns and the streams and the rocks. Like everything shares the same kernel of shared spirit, which is sometimes translated as humanity. Like everybody is a human, everybody is a person, but every single thing is wearing a different costume. So like the humans are wearing human form, the rocks are wearing rock form, the bird is dressed as a bird, and the anteater has his anteater costume on. But beneath that costume, before the form and shape, there is a kernel of shared humanity where the culture is shared. So there's kind of like that reflection that everything shares the same kind of humanity. So there's human people and there's non-human people. There's human people and there's bird people and there's tree people and there's plant people and there's coati people and so on and so forth. But what that means basically is that being a people, being a person, right? Like they also share the qualities and attributes that oftentimes we think that are uniquely human, right? Such as feeling emotion or being intentional about things or holding grudges or getting angry or being an agent in the world, right? So in the Amazonian worldview, not only humans have that, but everybody has that. The jaguar and the tapir and the bird, and everybody has like the same qualities of like being able to feel things and react accordingly and be an agent of impact in the world, right? And the Amazonian medical system is emergent from that worldview. So in the Amazon rainforest, for the indigenous people, traditional people, the Amazonian medical system is basically based on the idea that diseases and illnesses never happen in a vacuum. Right? Like nobody gets ill just because you get ill. You get ill because somebody made you ill. There's always an agent behind every human affliction. If you're sick, it's because somebody made you sick. Right? That somebody can be another person, but also can be a tree, it can be a plant, it can be an insect, it can be a sloth. Right? It's like, well, why would a sloth make me sick? Like, what did I do to the sloth that he wants to wish me ill? Like, well, basically what happens is that when a person gets sick, there's an agent who made them sick, and what happens is that person infringed in a rule of reciprocity. Right? There's the Amazonian lives are guided and ruled by rules of reciprocity, where the primary moral imperative always is to maintain those relationships reciprocal, harmony, balance. Right? There's many ways that people do that. I mean, one of the most famous, for example, we know like hunting taboos are very common within Amazonian societies. Right? Like there are people who rely on hunting for protein for the most part, or traditionally throughout history, they have relied on protein. But it's not like people wake up in the morning and then just go and kill animals and bring back meat, like whatever. There's very strict rituals and ceremonies and taboos that are enforced to ensure that this is done in a way that is conscious. Why? Because there's always have to be kind of that communication channel open between the human people and the non-human people, right? So if you want to go home, then there's a person who's oftentimes, kind of like the role that in the West we kind of reductively assign to the shaman and say like, well, I'm gonna communicate with deer people, and I'm gonna ask them like, hey, deer people, how are you doing? The human community is hungry, and we need meat, but we know that it's very important for us, the community, to always honor the harmony and balance and the reciprocity links between different, people. So we want to ask you like, how are you doing? Right? Like how has spring been for you? Are your females fertile? Are your offspring thriving? How many of you can we take to ensure that we are not hungry, but that your community can regenerate, right? So there's always kind of these conversations happening based on the fact that everybody is people, everybody is it's a community of subjects. So illness and disease, just to bring this back, titles back, illness and disease is not something that just happens. It happens because somehow, somewhere, somebody infringed in the rule of reciprocity. They walked somewhere they shouldn't have walked. They haunted somebody who they shouldn't have haunted. They pissed off the wrong tree, right, or so on and so forth, and they made them ill. So when you have to heal somebody, right, when you have to go and heal somebody, then the question is not necessarily like what happened to you when you were a child, or where in your body something is wrong, but rather like what relationship have you infringed on, right? Like what relationship have you messed up in your life for the other person to want to make you ill? And then the shaman, right, like the curandero in the Shipil tradition, which is the one that I'm more knowledgeable about, the Onaya, right, or the Yobue. Sometimes they would seek out through ayahuasca. In one approach is a very individualistic, psychologized version of everything can be fixed through analyzing myself and figuring out where in my past in biology and where in my childhood and where in my psychology are the seeds of this disease. And the other approach is like, which ones of your relationships need to be mended, right? Like where do you need to keep watering and tending to these relationships that actually give you the container for your life to be happy and healthy. So it's like a radically different approach. And I think what's been happening for the most part of like a hyper individualistic technology of cells, everything is about me, my own biology, my own psychology, my own biography, my own past, as opposed to kind of like actually listening to the wisdom of the traditions that we're engaging in, which are saying the opposite. It's like you want to be healthy and happy, get out of your own head and start looking around you. See, how are you embedded within your local community? How is your relationship with your family members? How's your relationship with your friends? Are you watering these plants relationships enough? Are you honoring the bonds of interdependent reciprocity that tie us to the sentient living world around us, right? And this is something that is, in my view, the most absolutely important aspect of this kind of work, which is like starting to acknowledge that human well-being, that human health is not a purely individualistic endeavor. And that if we really want to be happy and healthy, right, it is important that we start acknowledging the links between the health of the community and the health of the individual, the health of the society that we live in and the health of the individual, the health of the culture that envelops, in our lives, and the health of the individual, the health of the environment. Oh, you have depression, you have anxiety. This is something that is pretty much in your brain. So we're gonna give you this pill that is going to increase the level of your neurotransmitters, so you don't feel as sad. Whereas if you go to the Amazon rainforest, for example, like what anxiety is not very straightforward. If you ask a CPO person, I mean, this happens to me many times, right? It's kind of the main differences. It's like, like this patient that I have with me, he's struggling in his life because he has been diagnosed with anxiety and he's been suffering from anxiety for many years. And then they would ask me, well, what the hell is anxiety? What does that even mean? And then I have to explain, I have to describe what that experience is like in phenomenological terms, right? Well, anxiety for him, right, he says that what happens is that he has too many worries in his head. And no matter what's happening in his life, like he can't really shut off those worries because they're very present. And there's always kind of like this projection into the future and so on and so forth. So, oh yeah, well, he's worrying too much. I mean, a worry we can address. Anxiety, we don't know what that is. Similar with depression, right? Like, well, if you try to explain sometimes to a person from a different kind of cultural context who is not attached to kind of that cultural construct of Western biological psychiatry, what depression is, then you start to have to kind of give phenomenological descriptions. So like, well, that person is sad, but it's not regular sadness. It's a different flavor of sadness. It's kind of sadness that you can't get out of the bed in the morning, right? It's the kind of sadness where everything turns black and there's no hope. And there's a sense that no matter what you do, you're never going to be able to get out of that feeling, right? And then, the people healer will be like, okay, well, that's something that I can work with, right? Like that's something that I can relate to, that's something that I understand. There's just like an imbalance in that person's sadness, and we need to figure out like where that sadness is. And it's not that it's very straightforward for them to treat that, but there's a very big difference in the way that we address kind of like those constructs. In the Amazon rainforest, for example, there are these intrinsic connections and links that obviate almost the importance of healthy communities, healthy cultures, and healthy environments in the reflection of individual health, right? Which in the West we have completely almost lost track of. And we tend to individualize everything so much and blame the individuals for their own shortcomings, and almost never really addressing the systemic failures that are creating so much suffering in this way. So whether the individual, is struggling with depression or anxiety, it is very important to also provide a perspective for it. Like, well, maybe the depression is not only a failure in your part or a, hardware problem in the wiring of your brain that requires pharmacological intervention exclusively, but actually maybe it's important to examine the way that you're embedded within a healthy community or not, which is mostly the case, right? Like loneliness now is one of the major issues in Western society. Maybe it is important to start understanding that, if we're working two jobs, two full-time jobs and barely making to pay rent and having like this kind of financial existential struggles, maybe that anxiety is not a problem in our brains, but it's a problem in the way that our socioeconomic systems are set up, right? Depression and anxiety that are very common now, like oftentimes we don't really see the links within like the wider realms of human embeddedness, right? But when people start realizing, well, actually our environments, are like not doing good, and scientists, environmental scientists, and people that are in this world keep telling us that pretty much like windows of opportunity for reversing the damages of global warming are closed, and we're basically in free fall towards mass extinction. I mean, that's something that obviously is gonna create anxiety for people when we don't really see, but these are things that are not very much addressed in kind of like Western psychiatric environments, and more so within, the translation from our ideologies and views towards like plant medicine spaces. We bring that with us, and we tend to think more and more and more again and again and again that everything can be solved if we just address the individual problem. But almost nobody is actually offering frameworks that can allow people to address the systemic problems, and at least to consider that maybe there are things that cannot be solved through individual interventions, but that need to be solved in a more systemic way through addressing structural problems and architectural problems and the kind of things that require that people get out of their own heads and actually start looking outside from themselves. Yeah, I mean, they're incredibly useful. I think they have they still have a huge potential, and I think I'm not convinced that psychedelics or plant medicines do anything inherently. Yeah, this is kind of like one of the debates I think that is still ongoing in whether psychedelic substances and plant medicines have intrinsic attributes, that they have a tendency to elicit certain experiences more than others. What kind of narratives are we sharing about what these substances are for, right? Which is a huge part of the setting. I mean, we do know certain settings have a massive influence in the outcome of an experience, and I think one of the least addressed and least understood parts of the setting is the story, like the storytelling part of it, right? So if we are promoting psychedelics as we are nowadays within a neoliberal framework that's helping people increase productivity in the workplace and heal individual afflictions so they can be, whatever, then that's what people are going to experience for the most part. I think if we offer people a much wider framework than that one, and more people were experiencing plant medicine, from a perspective of understanding a little bit better and in a more intellectually honest way the actual framework from which these substances originate. I mean, I'm talking specifically about ayahuasca, but obviously, I mean, we can adapt that for other things. I mean, the peyote practices of the Wixárika people in Mexico, the Raramuri people in Mexico, they're still also like very much embedded within like this very interdependent framework. So I think like it would be a great thing for people, particularly people who are drinking ayahuasca, particularly people who are going to the rainforest, particularly people who are, interacting with Amazonian people, to have access to a much better interpretation of the local worldviews and the local ideologies, and the local ontologies and epistemologies, rather than just kind of like these marketing devices that are offered by most healing retreats and by most people who are kind of like repeating the same tired narrative, which is like your own personal transformation is the best gift that you can give to the world, so on and so forth. And like it's still encased within that extremely limiting, hyper individualistic narrative. So yeah, I mean, I think psychedelics and plant medicines are great, and I think they would be even better if we actually took the time and the effort to understand the ontological frameworks better and to provide people with these interdependent narratives to kind of change the stories that we're offering people who are coming to retreat centers, change the narrative that we're offering to people who want to heal with the help of psychedelics, and kind of expand the notion, right, that human suffering is not intrinsically rooted in our individual makeup, and that most of our afflictions actually don't come from childhood trauma, which is kind of the psychoanalytic dogma per excellence, but that actually the main thing that we struggle with nowadays are relational. Like, I mean, this is something that is already kind of been identified in certain circles. I know in the social sciences, for example, loneliness is a big research topic, right? Particularly in Western cultures. I mean, loneliness nowadays is understood to be a much bigger risk factor to public health and individual health than things that we thought in the past were massive, like obesity, for example, right? Like we know now that loneliness is one of the main predictive or predictors of all sorts of different, not only mental conditions, but things like hypertension and so on and so forth, right? So if we're not addressing loneliness, if we're not addressing social disconnection, if we're not addressing alienation, if we're not addressing the atomization of society, if we're not addressing the ongoing erosion of our social connectedness and the destruction of the social fabric of our societies, if we're not addressing the obvious anxiety that comes from environmental destruction and the uncertainty that comes from knowing that we're in free fall towards possible extinction. I mean, these are things that you don't find very often in these spaces, because most spaces are still very much attached to like, we're going to address your personal trauma, your individual affliction, and that's going to solve everything. And the truth is that's not going to solve much as long as we're not really addressing those relational concerns. Yeah, I mean, Healing from Healing is a project that was born really out of frustration and irritation with the current zeitgeist of healing culture. The healing culture is kind of like my analytic construct, which I kind of like see healing culture as being kind of like this behemoth that has become very powerful nowadays, right? Like everybody has trauma, everybody has to heal, everybody's on a healing path, everybody's on a healing journey. And I think, there's very good things about it, but it's also like very unfortunate aspects of this healing culture. From the consumerism that relies on, from the very narrow perspective that it takes on what it means to be happy and healthy, from the perpetuation of this hyper individualistic mindset where everything is about me, my own journey, my own healing, and finding out my, repressed memories and so on and so forth, which is a whole other topic that is very problematic. And as a result of that, something that is like, I think like the main thing that was really worrisome for me was kind of like the potential projection and exponential growth of narcissistic tendencies and behaviors in a culture that is already afflicted with, yeah, like, I mean, I don't use narcissism lightly, and I don't use that in a clinical sense, which is something I think is important. I mean, I think narcissistic personality disorder is a real thing, and narcissisms are labels that nowadays get thrown around too much. Yeah, like every person who's been hurt by an ex-boyfriend or girlfriend, like now that person is a narcissist, and they did so and so to me, so they're a narcissist. And but I mean narcissism, as a diagnostic construct of a general cultural and social malady. I think that we're experiencing more and more that, again, it's kind of, an inevitable result of this intersection between neoliberalism and hyper individualism, and kind of like the more and more restrictive focus on the individual self as the main unit of whatever is a focus really, in the world. Margaret Thatcher, she was one of the, well, the kind of like the mother of neoliberal theory. She used to say like society is an abstraction, right? Like everything that exists is the individual, and society is an abstraction. And I think that kind of thinking, in many ways, has gotten us to the point that we are now, when Western societies are overrun by afflictions that at its root they have loneliness and alienation, in that sense that there's nothing that we can rely on other than individual agency, and that it's not important to maintain, bonds with people, and then communities are not important. And, all those things are real. I mean, I think they're mostly more potent or much more intensified in North American cultures than they are in South European cultures, for example, where there's still, we were talking about this before, when there's still kind of like a sense of getting to know your neighbors and having kind of like buildings coming onto the streets and having communal meals and like neighborhood fiestas. In North American societies, in my experience and what I've seen, those things are non-existent, and people just live in this radical encapsulation of individual experience, where the others are almost ghosts that happen to live alongside us, and there's a lot of fear happening and like connectedness and so on and so forth. So I think like healing culture basically reproduces a lot of that zeitgeist, because a lot of that does come from North American culture in many ways, right? So we tend to address healing and growth still as it was a project of entrepreneurship of the self, right? Like I'm gonna apply the same mindset and the same like energy that I have to like my business making. I'm gonna apply that to like my personal growth and healing. And this is nothing new. Like self growth and like the personal growth movement has been kind of a staple of North American and most more Western culture for many many years. But I think now this has been hugely exponentially intensified, and psychedelics also kind of got playing a huge part in it. But when we apply psychedelics, to that same framework, then what happens is not necessarily more introspection and more mindfulness around healing relationships, but very often what happens is narcissism on steroids. It's just this completely delusional and ungrounded perspective of aggrandizement and ego inflation and all sorts of different phenomena that psychedelics, are known to elicit. And without having a framework, without having the proper support, without having the proper integration tools to be able to make some of those experiences, other than this kind of like self-entrepreneurship and pop psychology frameworks, and kind of like social media, Instagram reflective, platforms that in their essence are also very much prone to aggrandizing and exponentially kind of like magnifying those narcissistic tendencies that we have in Western cultures. I think what we're experiencing now is pretty much a very dangerous mixture that we're seeing more and more and more. So, I mean, Healing from Healing was basically, again, part of a project that was born out of my frustration with seeing how these things were unfolding. And it's not something that is born out of like just me, perching somewhere in high ground and observing other people. But it's like my personal experience of me like catching myself exactly in these things that I'm experiencing. And like for many years, I was stuck in this loop of like, I need to do another ceremony, another diet, and another course, another workshop, and I have to do that and read that book because there's something in me that is still unhealed, and I need to grow, and I need to do this. And like just like this endless vortex of like entrepreneurship of my own kind of like character and persona. And so, and at some point, I kind of like had to step back from it and say like this is unhealthy. Like this is not going anywhere. Like I'm not happier. I'm not healthier. I'm just like stuck in this constant navel gazing. I'm just stuck in this kind of like constant like narcissistic loop of like the most important thing is like my own personal process, and always not process, and always like working on something. And it just I started seeing myself more and more. I started seeing the people around us, and it took a massive event such as COVID really to yank me out of that, right? Like completely uproot me from the place that I was, like send me home like completely lost, like not knowing what to do, back to my family, back to my friends, back to basics, back to like trying to find like different ways of relating to people. And as these last couple of years progressed, I started having like the perspective, right, that distance can afford, like the right perspective to start examining like my own journey and my own trajectory and that of the people around me. And then in a wider sense, like the culture as a whole, like that culture that I have been a part of and I'm still a part of. Yeah, I'm not outside of it. I'm not like criticizing shit as an outsider. I'm like 100% fully immersed in it. So like what I do basically is trying to see how can we do these things better, right? Like how can we actually use these tools and techniques and many of the insights that do come from popular psychology maybe and self-help and new age spirituality that yeah maybe some of them are ridiculous but some of them may have something to offer, but it's just a matter of what kind of framework we're offering people so that we are less prone to fall into these vortices of delusion and self-aggrandizing and magical thinking and narcissism. And the tool that I find to be the most effective. And this is the thing that I try to always bring forth through that platform. Like, well, we're gonna address issues that are gonna trigger the fuck out of people. Yeah, we're gonna address like our narcissistic tendencies. We're gonna address the propensity for magical thinking that permeates psychedelia and new age spirituality and pop psychology. We're gonna address like the hyper individualistic consumerism, and we're gonna address, the fact that most people, um, things that are gonna trigger other people that I think are important to address. So humor is the only way I think that can be done effectively. Because if that's not done with humor, then the only thing that's gonna cause is antagonism, and it's gonna cause rejection. It's gonna cause oh, like that person is just condescending, and that person is just criticizing, and that person is just kind of like taking a moral high ground, which sometimes I am. I can be condescending, and I can be overly critical, and I can be all those things. But like using humor as a vehicle, then it's much easier for those critics to land well with people and say, oh yeah, that's funny, but also I recognize that in me. Maybe there's something for me to look at instead of like, oh, like that's fucked up. I don't want to listen to this person anymore. So I mean, for example, the workshop that I live right now, they from the moment that people arrive, the first introduction that we have is a talk that I give laying down the framework that we're gonna be working with, which is a framework that is relational. Yeah, it's very important for us that from the moment that people arrive to our retreat, and like our groups are not very big. There's 12 people, sometimes 14 people. They come for 3 weeks, and from the moment they arrive, like the first introduction, the first interaction is a conversation around what healing is, right? And like what healing can be. And many of the principles and points that I covered here are things that I go very much in depth, like illuminating from the very first day, right? The fact that healing and growth are not and cannot ever be exclusively individualized processes, that we from the very moment that we arrive, we're gonna always have one eye inward, kind of like introspecting and analyzing and psychoanalyzing and all things which are important, but also one eye outward, examining structures, examining structural violence, examining the way that we're embedded within communities and cultures and societies, socioeconomic systems, the impact that they have on our well-being. Right? Like I tell them, the very first day they arrive, I tell them like, you have many resources here at your disposal and at your disposition. You have all the staff and all these activities and skills and tools, but the most important resource that you will have throughout your time here is always going to be each other, right? And each person's journey here is always going to be interdependent with everybody else. Like nobody can be fully happy and healthy unless everybody here is happy and healthy. That's kind of like the basic tagline, right? Like for anybody here to be happy and healthy, then we have to make sure that everybody's happy and healthy. And that means like really like a degree of mutual responsibility and reciprocity that people oftentimes find very refreshing, but never experience that, right? Like this is maybe for many people it's the first time where they're thrown into an environment where they start understanding that this is not only about them, right? Like even if they pay lots of money to be there, and even if they made many sacrifices to be able to travel there, and like they want to focus on their own thing, that's a fantasy, right? Like nobody can do that, and it's important to address that from the very beginning. Like we're here for each other, and oftentimes, like inevitably at the end of the workshop, I mean, always, I mean, you know this, you've probably seen this many times because you've seen many groups, but people, oftentimes arrive as total strangers, and there's apprehension, and there's like, who is this person? And I don't know if I'm gonna vibe with this person, and so on. But like as time progresses and all these different mechanisms set in, uh, you know, uh, ceremonies happen, people go through hormesis, right? This is like this process of going through hardship and then going through hormesis together and hardship together and the bonding that happens. And after a few days, people find out that they're family, right? There's kind of like this very deep, strong bonding, which actually, by the way, is the focus of my research at Imperial College, which is kind of like that experience of comunitas, right? Like that sense of like the arising of that sense of shared togetherness that is rare to find and happens in certain environments, but you need to calibrate for it. It's not something that happens organically, right? Like you need to have certain things that like allow for that sense of comunitas to happen. Psychedelics are a very easy way to elicit that sense of shared togetherness, precisely because people go through very deeply meaningful experiences together, right? And it's that sense of shared togetherness, like understanding that the people can be vulnerable and can be authentic and they can share with each other, and that suffering doesn't have to remain private, and breaking that spell of loneliness and alienation that is at the root source of all the other experiences of, you know, many times anxiety and depression, then that oftentimes is in itself the most important aspect of the workshop. And this is something that I consistently found in the interviews that I made over and over and over. Like when you ask people, what was the most important part of this workshop for you? Well, the most important thing was the people that I met, the relationships that I made, right? Like the experience that I had, or what actually it feels like to, or what it could be like, living embedded within healthy, reciprocal, mutually responsible relationships, experiences that the majority of people that come to the retreat never had before. So just the knowledge that that's possible, that there's a possibility to experience, to live life like that, where there's like that interdependence, where, where reciprocity is not a choice, then that's something that can give people like a massive boost, and a very, very different framework. So that's the thing that we like to foster in our retreats, like from the very beginning, from the get-go. It's like, this is not about you, this is not an individual endeavor. Yeah, it is in many ways. It's like kind of like, it's simultaneously deeply personal, deeply private, deeply individual experience, but also at the same time, this is collective, right? And that collectivity does entail that degree of mutual responsibility that in itself ends up being one of the most healing aspects of that workshop.